The stagecoach lurched violently to the left, throwing Evelyn Carr against the unforgiving wooden frame of the cabin. Dust, thick and tasting of alkaline and dried manure, filtered through the canvas flaps, settling into the fine lace of her collar like a permanent stain. When the driver finally hauled on the reins and shouted the horses to a halt, the silence that followed was not peaceful. It was heavy, oppressive, and vast. Evelyn stepped down into the street of Dry Bend, Wyoming, her boots sinking into an inch of powdery earth. The year was 1887, and she was 2,000 miles from the parlor in Boston where she had once played Chopin and discussed literature. Behind her, the driver unstrapped her 2 trunks, leather-bound, brass-cornered, and ridiculously out of place in this landscape of gray sage and weathered timber. She stood alone on the boardwalk outside the Mercantile, smoothing the skirts of her navy traveling dress. It was a sensible color, she had thought, but here, amidst the brown denim and faded calico of the locals, it looked like a costume. A group of men sat on the porch of the saloon across the way, whittling and spitting tobacco. Their eyes felt like physical weights on her skin. She heard the murmur, low but distinct, carried on the dry wind. That is the Carr girl. The banker's daughter? The same. Father put a pistol in his mouth after the bank failed. Left her with nothing but the clothes on her back and a name nobody wants to cash a check on. Evelyn stiffened, her spine becoming a rod of steel. She refused to look at them. She had come here because it was the only place where a distant cousin had secured her a position before the scandal had fully broken. She was to be the schoolmistress. It was a humiliating step down for a woman who had been courted by senators' sons. But dignity was a luxury she could no longer afford. Survival was the only currency left. The cousin, it turned out, had moved on to Oregon 2 months prior, leaving her a letter and a prepaid month at Mrs. Higgins's boarding house. Evelyn walked there now, signaling a boy to bring her trunks with a coin she could barely spare. Mrs. Higgins was a bird-like woman with sharp eyes and a mouth that looked as if it had never tasted sugar. She showed Evelyn to a room that smelled of lye soap and stale air. "Rent is due on the 1st, Mrs., Higgins said, wiping her hands on her apron. "No gentlemen callers, no cooking in the room, and we do not gossip in this house. Miss Carr, though Lord knows your family has given the papers enough to chew on for a decade." Evelyn merely nodded. "I require rest. Mrs. Higgins, thank you." The door clicked shut. Only then did Evelyn allow her shoulders to slump. She walked to the small, distorted mirror above the wash basin and looked at her reflection. Her face was pale, her dark hair pulled back severely. She looked like a ghost haunting her own life. "You are Evelyn Carr," she whispered to the empty room. "You will not break." The schoolhouse was a single room of whitewashed plank situated on a rise of land just outside the town proper. It was freezing in the mornings and stifling by noon. The children were wild things, mostly sons and daughters of cattlemen and miners, who looked at her refined manners and precise diction as if she were a creature from a zoo. She taught them geography, tracing her finger across maps of places they would likely never see. She taught them arithmetic, though they knew more about counting head of cattle than she ever would. But it was the adults who made her life a misery. On Sundays, at the small wooden church, the women gathered in tight circles, their bonnets bobbing like angry crows. They turned their backs when she approached. They were hard women, forged by wind and sun, and they despised her soft hands and her high-toned voice. They sensed her vulnerability, and, like wolves, they circled. "I heard she brought silk sheets," one woman whispered loud enough for Evelyn to hear. "Silk, in Dry Bend. Who is she trying to impress?" "Probably looking for a husband to pay off her daddy's debts," another sneered. "As if any decent man would take on that baggage." It was 3 weeks into her tenure when the wagon wheel broke. Evelyn had borrowed a small buckboard to transport firewood to the schoolhouse, a task the town council refused to pay a man to do. The road was rutted deep from the spring rains, now baked into concrete hard ridges. The front left wheel caught a stone. The wood shrieked, and the wagon tilted dangerously, spilling logs across the dusty track. Evelyn scrambled down, her heart hammering. She was 2 miles from town. The sun was beating down on the back of her neck, making her dizzy. She grabbed a heavy log, trying to heave it back into the wagon bed, but the weight tore at her gloves and scraped her wrist. She dropped the log. Frustration welled up in her throat, hot and stinging. She would not cry. She would not give them the satisfaction. Then a shadow fell over her. She turned to see a rider on a large, mottled gray horse. He sat easy in the saddle, a man who seemed carved from the landscape itself. He wore a duster coat stained with the red dust of the trail, and his hat was pulled low, shading his eyes. He did not speak. He simply swung a leg over the saddle horn and dropped to the ground. His boots hit the earth with a solid thud. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, but thin, as if the land had rendered all the fat from his frame, leaving only muscle and bone. He walked past her, the smell of horse sweat, leather, and sagebrush washing over her. He bent down, effortlessly lifted the heavy axle of the wagon with one shoulder, and kicked a large stone underneath to prop it up. Evelyn stared. "Thank you," she managed, her voice breathless. The man did not look at her. He took a hammer and a pouch of tools from his saddlebag. He worked with efficient, fluid movements, knocking the rim back into place and securing the spokes. His hands were large, scarred, and utterly capable. When he finished, he kicked the stone away and lowered the wagon. He turned to her then. His face was a map of exposure. Deep lines fanned from the corners of his eyes, which were a startling, clear hazel amidst the tan of his skin. He had a 3-day growth of beard, dark and coarse. He looked like a man who had forgotten how to be around people. "Axles cracked," he said. His voice was like gravel crunching under a boot heel, low, rough, and quiet. "It will hold town. Go slow. I am very grateful." "Mr." Evelyn paused, waiting. He hesitated, shifting his weight. "Ward, Eli Ward. Mr. Ward. I am Evelyn Carr." He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture that seemed painful for him. "I know." He mounted his horse in one smooth motion and rode away without looking back. When Evelyn finally limped the wagon back into town, she passed the livery stable. A group of men were lounging there, laughing when they saw her, and then saw Eli Ward riding 100 yards ahead of her. The laughter turned sharp. "Look at that," a man named Silas Thorne jeered. He was a wealthy cattle broker who had tried to grab Evelyn's arm the week she arrived. "The princess and the pauper. Did Eli fix your wagon, Miss Carr?" Surprised he didn't break it worse. "The man's got dirt for brains." "Leave him be." "Silas," another man muttered, though he was grinning. "Eli's just looking for a stray. Maybe he thinks he found one." Evelyn flushed crimson. She looked at Eli, expecting him to react, to defend himself. But Eli Ward just kept riding, his back straight, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if the town and its petty cruelty did not exist. The gifts began a week later. It started with apples. 3 of them, small but bright red and free of bruises, were sitting on the corner of her desk when she unlocked the schoolhouse door. There was no note. 2 days later, she found the steps of the schoolhouse, which had been loose and dangerous for months, repaired with fresh lumber and sturdy iron nails. Then, a hairpin. It was sitting on the railing of the boarding house porch where she often sat in the evenings to read. It was hand-carved from a piece of dark walnut, smoothed to a satin finish, with the delicate shape of a sparrow at the end. Evelyn held the hairpin in her palm, running her thumb over the wood. It was not the work of a man with dirt for brains. It was the work of a man who saw things. She began to watch for him. She learned that he worked for the Triple Bar Ranch, riding fences and managing the herd in the high pastures. He came to town only on Saturdays for supplies. He never entered the saloon. He bought his flour, his coffee, and his ammunition. And then he sat on the bench outside the blacksmith's shop, smoking a pipe and saying nothing. He was a ghost in the town, present but separate. The women mocked him for his ragged clothes, shirts that had been patched so many times the original fabric was a mystery. The men mocked him for his silence, calling him simple, slow-witted, a brute who knew only cows and silence. He has no people, Mrs. Higgins told Evelyn one evening over a supper of watery stew. Drifted in here 5 years ago. Works hard, I'll give him that, but there is something off about him. Hollow, like a tree that's rotted out from the inside. Evelyn looked at the hairpin, which she had tucked into her bun. Perhaps he is just lonely. Mrs. Higgins snorted. Men like Eli Ward do not get lonely. Miss Carr, they just get old and die. But Evelyn was lonely. The loneliness was a physical ache in her chest. The money from her father's estate, what little had been hidden away, was gone. Her teaching salary was $20 a month. Mrs. Higgins had already informed her that rent would be increasing in the autumn. She was trapped. She was 24 years old, educated, refined, and slowly starving to death in a town that hated her. One rainy Tuesday, she saw Eli Ward walking down the muddy street. He was walking with a slight limp, soaked to the bone, carrying a heavy sack of grain over one shoulder. He looked exhausted. He looked solitary. And suddenly, Evelyn saw not a rough hand, but a lifeline. She did not let herself think. If she thought, she would remember the ballrooms of Boston and the dreams she once had of a husband who quoted Keats. She grabbed her shawl and ran out into the rain. "Mr. Ward!" He stopped and turned. The rain dripped from the brim of his hat. His hazel eyes widened slightly at the sight of her standing in the mud. "Miss Carr," he said, I wanted to thank you for the apples and the steps." She touched her hair. "And this?" He looked at his boots. Wood was just laying there. "It is beautiful." He said nothing. The rain hissed around them. "Mr. Ward," Evelyn said, her voice trembling. She clenched her hands in her skirts. "I have a proposition for you." He looked up, his brow furrowed. "Ma'am? I need a home," she said, the words tumbling out fast, desperate. "I cannot stay at the boarding house. I have no money. I have no family. I am drowning here. Mr. Ward." He watched her, his face unreadable. "I am a hard worker." She pressed on, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I can cook. I can keep a house. I can mend clothes. I believe we could help one another." Eli stood very still. The water ran down the deep lines of his face. "You are asking to be my wife?" "Yes." "You do not know me." "I know you are kind," she said. "And I know you are alone. So am I." He looked past her, toward the hills shrouded in gray mist. A muscle feathered in his jaw. For a long moment, she thought he would walk away, leaving her humiliated in the street. "I have nothing," he said finally. "Just a shack in the foothills and a few heads of my own stock. It is a hard life. Miss Carr, it is not for the likes of you." "I have nowhere else to go," she whispered. "Please." He looked at her then, really looked at her, with an intensity that made her breath catch. It was not lust. It was a strange, sorrowful recognition. "All right," he said softly. "All right." They were married 3 days later by the confused and disapproval-laden Reverend Thomas. The church was empty save for the sexton and Mrs. Higgins, whom Evelyn had dragged along as a witness. Evelyn wore her best dress, a dove-gray silk that had seen better days. Eli wore a suit that was clearly 20 years out of style, the black wool shiny with age, the sleeves slightly too short for his long arms. He had shaved, revealing a strong, square jaw and a pale scar running along his neck, disappearing into his collar. When he took her hand to place the simple gold band on her finger, his hand was trembling. His palm was rough, calloused like old leather, but his touch was incredibly light. Eli, take the, Evelyn." His voice was a rumble, low and steady. When they walked out of the church, the sun was blinding. A group of townsfolk had gathered, alerted by the gossip mill. "Well, I never—" Clara, the sheriff's daughter, laughed openly. She was a pretty, sharp-faced girl who leaned against a post, twirling a parasol. "The Lady and the Tramp," Make sure he wipes his boots before he goes into your imaginary mansion. Evelyn. Reckon she's desperate enough to bed down with a steer if it had a roof over its head. A miner guffawed. Eli stopped. His hand tightened on Evelyn's arm. For a second, a dangerous energy radiated off him, a coiling of violence that terrified her. He looked at the men, his hazel eyes turning abruptly cold. The laughter died down, uncertainly. Then, just as quickly, the tension vanished. Eli tipped his hat to Clara, a gesture of mockery so subtle Evelyn almost missed it. "Come," he said to Evelyn. He helped her into the wagon, the same one he had fixed. Her trunks were already loaded in the back. He climbed up beside her and snapped the reins. They rode in silence for hours. The town fell away, replaced by rolling sagebrush plains, then climbing foothills dotted with scrub oak and juniper. The air grew thinner, sharper. The sky was a vast, bruising purple as twilight approached. Evelyn sat rigid on the hard wooden seat. Panic was beginning to claw at her throat. What had she done? She was riding into the wilderness with a stranger, a man the town called simple, a man who barely spoke. "Are you cold?" Eli asked. It was the first thing he had said in 5 miles. "A little," she admitted. He reached behind the seat and pulled out a rough wool blanket. He draped it over her shoulders. He didn't linger, didn't try to touch her more than necessary. "Almost there," he said. They crested a ridge, and the cabin came into view. Evelyn's heart sank. It was not a house. It was a shack, built of rough-hewn logs and chinking that looked like it was crumbling. It sat in the shadow of a looming rock face. There was a small corral with 2 horses, a lean-to for wood, and nothing else. No garden, no neighbors, just the wind howling through the canyon. Eli pulled the wagon to a halt. He set the brake and jumped down. He came around to her side and reached up. "Evelyn," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She stared at his hands. She looked at the bleak, dark cabin. Tears pricked her eyes. She could not do this. She could not live here. It was the end of everything she had ever been. She started, ready to ask him to take her back, to accept the humiliation of the boarding house, to accept starvation. "I know it ain't much," Eli said. His voice was raw. He wasn't looking at the cabin. He was looking at her face, reading every line of her fear. "I know it ain't what you're used to, but the roof is sound, and it's warm, and you will be safe here. Safe." The word hung in the cold air. She looked into his eyes. There was no deception there, no mockery, just a naked, terrifying hope that he was trying desperately to hide. She took a breath, swallowing the panic. She placed her gloved hands on his shoulders. "Help me down, Eli." He lifted her easily, setting her on the ground. He did not let go immediately. For a second, they stood chest to chest in the gathering dark. He smelled of pine pitch and honest sweat. He carried her trunks inside. The interior was a single room. There was a wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a bed in the corner covered with a heavy quilt. It was sparse, cleaner than she expected, but utterly masculine and bare. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a chair. He knelt by the stove. He struck a match against his boot heel and lit the kindling he had laid ready. The fire caught, casting a golden, flickering light against the log walls. The warmth began to spread, chasing away the chill of the high desert night. Evelyn watched him. He moved with a grace that belied his size. He took a kettle, filled it from a bucket, and set it on the stove. "I have some tea," he said, not looking at her. "Bought it last month. Heard folks like you drink it." Evelyn felt a lump form in her throat. He bought tea a month ago, before she had even spoken to him properly. "Thank you," she whispered. Night settled fully over the canyon. The silence outside was absolute, save for the cry of a coyote in the distance. When the time came to sleep, the awkwardness returned, thick and suffocating. There was only one bed. Eli stood by the fire, his back to her. "I can sleep in the barn," he said. Until you are used to things." Evelyn looked at the bed. Then she looked at his slumped shoulders. He expected her to send him away. He expected to be treated like the hired help, even in his own home. She remembered the hairpin. She remembered the apple. She remembered the way he had stood before the town's mockery, taking it so she wouldn't have to. She stood up and began to unbutton the cuffs of her traveling dress. Her fingers shook, but her voice was steady. "You are my husband, Eli. You will sleep in your bed." He turned slowly. The firelight caught the side of his face, illuminating the scar on his neck. He stared at her, his eyes wide, vulnerable. "Evelyn," he said, his voice cracking. "I am a rough man. I don't have words. I don't know how to be what you need." She walked to him. She reached out and took his hand, the hand that had lifted the wagon, the hand that had carved the delicate bird. It was rough, swallowing hers completely. "You gave me a home," she said softly. "That is what I needed." She saw a tremor go through him. He raised her hand slowly, as if he were afraid he might break it, and pressed his lips to her knuckles. His lips were chapped, but the kiss was reverent. It was an act of worship. "I will take care of you," he swore, his breath warm against her skin. "As long as there is breath in my body, I will take care of you." Evelyn looked at this stranger she had married. The fear was still there. Yes, the cabin was cold, and the world outside was harsh. But as he held her hand in the firelight, she felt something anchored deep in her chest. She nodded. "I know." She turned and began to undress for bed, turning her back to him for modesty. She heard him blow out the lantern. In the darkness, the fire crackled, snapping softly. She heard the rustle of his clothes, the heavy sigh of the mattress ropes as he lay down on the far edge, keeping a respectful distance between them. Evelyn Carr lay in the dark, listening to the wind buffet the small cabin. She was an outcast. She was poor. She was married to a man the world called a fool, but as she drifted towards sleep, she could feel the warmth radiating from him, solid and steady against the cold. And for the first time since her father's pistol had echoed in the study back in Boston, she did not feel entirely alone. The silence of the high country was different from the silence of a Boston library or a parlor after the guests had gone. It was a living, breathing thing, vast and indifferent to human comfort. For the first month of her marriage, Evelyn Carr felt that silence pressing against her eardrums like water deep underwater. The cabin was situated 5 miles from the nearest neighbor and 10 miles from the town of Dry Bend proper. It sat in the throat of a box canyon where the wind funneled down from the peaks, rattling the loose shingles on the roof and whistling through the chinking of the logs. Evelyn learned quickly that being a rancher's wife was less about romance and more about an endless, grinding battle against dust. Eli was gone before the sun crested the eastern ridge. He would rise in the gray pre-dawn, moving quietly in the dark to pull on his boots and heavy canvas coat. He would light the stove for her, ensuring the kindling caught, and boil a pot of coffee black enough to float a horseshoe. By the time Evelyn woke, there would be a mug of it sitting on the table, covered with a saucer to keep it warm, and he would be miles away. Riding the fence line or searching for stray calves in the brush, he would not return until the stars were sharp and cold in the sky. The loneliness was a physical ache. Evelyn had no one to speak to. She would find herself narrating her chores aloud just to hear a human voice. "Now I'm sweeping the hearth," she would say to the empty room. "Now I am kneading the dough. Now I am watching the hawk circle the pine tree." The isolation was absolute, but worse than the isolation was the reception she received when she did venture into town. Every Tuesday, Evelyn hitched the mare to the wagon, a skill she had forced herself to learn with trembling hands and several bruised fingers, and rode into Dry Bend for supplies. She wore her plainest dresses, hoping to blend in, but the fabric was still too fine, her posture too straight, her accent too clipped. The general store was the hub of the town, smelling of pickle brine, sawdust, and curing tobacco. It was also the courtroom where Evelyn was tried and convicted weekly. On a particularly sweltering Tuesday in July, Evelyn stood at the counter, counting out the coins for a sack of flour and a tin of lard. Mrs. Gable, the proprietor's wife, weighed the flour with agonizing slowness, her eyes darting over Evelyn's shoulder to the two women standing by the bolt fabric. One of them was Clara, the sheriff's daughter. Clara was 20, with hair the color of corn silk and a mouth that seemed permanently curled in amusement. She had been the belle of Dry Bend until she had set her cap for Eli Ward 2 years prior and been quietly, but firmly, rebuffed. "I hear the wind up at the canyon drives people mad," Clara said, her voice pitched perfectly to Carrie. She was examining a ribbon, twisting it around her finger. "Especially city folk. They just aren't built for the quiet. They need applause." The woman beside her, a miner's wife with a face like a dried apple, tittered. "I give it till the first snow." "She will run back east to whatever charity will take her." Evelyn's hand froze on the counter. She could feel the heat rising up her neck. She placed a silver dollar on the wood. "That should cover it, Mrs. Gable," Evelyn said, her voice steady. Clara turned, feigning surprise. "Oh, Mrs. Ward, I didn't see you there. How is our dear Eli? Still smelling of manure and barely 2 words to rub together?" Evelyn turned slowly. The store went quiet. Even the men playing checkers by the stove looked up. "My husband works hard, Miss Clara," Evelyn said, her tone ice cold. "It is honest labor. Perhaps if more men in this town attended to their own work rather than the business of others, there would be less time for idle gossip." Clara's eyes narrowed. "He is a simpleton. Evelyn, you married a stray dog because you had no other bed to sleep in. Don't pretend it is a love match. We all know you are just waiting for him to die or leave so you can sell that patch of rocks he calls a ranch." "You speak with a great deal of authority on a man who wanted nothing to do with you," Evelyn replied. The silence that followed was absolute. Clara's face went splotchy and red. Evelyn gathered her sack of flour, hefting the weight against her hip, and walked out the door, her head high. She held her composure until the wagon was a mile out of town. Then, she pulled the mare to a halt in the shade of a cottonwood tree and wept. She cried until her throat burned, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. It was the injustice of it, the sheer, petty cruelty. When Eli came home that night, the cabin was dark save for the glow of the stove. Evelyn was sitting at the table, staring at her hands. Eli hung his hat on the peg and washed his face in the basin. He sensed the mood immediately. He moved with that quiet, predatory grace of his, pulling out a chair and sitting opposite her. "Supper is cold," she said dully. "I don't mind," he said. He watched her. "What happened?" Evelyn looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed. "Why do they hate me? Eli? I have done nothing to them. I teach their children. I mind my business. And they look at me as if I am a disease." Eli sighed, a sound that seemed to rattle deep in his chest. He reached across the table, his hand hovering near hers but not touching. "It ain't hate, Evelyn. It feels like hate. They are small people living in a big hard land," Eli said softly. "They scrape by. They bleed for every inch. Then you show up. You talk like a book. You walk like you own the ground beneath your feet. You remind them of everything they ain't never gonna be. That is no excuse for cruelty." "No," Eli agreed. "It ain't. But that is the reason. They don't like what they don't understand. And they don't understand you. Just like they don't understand me." "They call you simple," she whispered. "They mock you?" Eli shrugged, picking up a piece of cold cornbread. "Let them talk. Words don't put fences up. Words don't break horses. I know who I am. That is enough." He looked at her then, his hazel eyes piercing. "Do you know who you are, Evelyn?" She opened her mouth to answer, but the words died. Did she? She was a banker's daughter who was now a rancher's wife. She was a woman between worlds. "I am trying to find out," she said. Eli nodded. "Then let them talk. We have work to do." The confrontation changed something in her. Evelyn realized that waiting for acceptance was a fool's game. If this shack was to be her prison, she would make it a palace. If this life was her sentence, she would serve it with a dignity that would shame them all. She attacked the cabin with a ferocity that bordered on manic. She scrubbed the rough plank floors with lye and sand until the wood was bleached white and smooth to the touch. She took the flour sacks, washed the branding ink out of them, and sewed curtains for the 2 small windows, embroidering the hems with wildflowers she found in the canyon, bluebells and Indian paintbrush. She demanded Eli plow a patch of earth on the south side of the cabin. "Nothing grows there but sage," Eli warned, leaning on his shovel. "The ground is as hard as iron." "Then we will break it," Evelyn said, tucking her skirts into her waistband. She worked alongside him, her hands unprotected, pulling rocks from the soil until her fingers bled. They hauled manure from the corral to enrich the dust. She planted seeds she had ordered from a catalog, carrots, potatoes, beans, and squash. Every morning, she carried buckets of water from the creek, fighting the sun that tried to bake the life out of her seedlings. And slowly, miraculously, green shoots broke the surface. The transformation was not just in the land, it was in the cabin. The smell of stale smoke was replaced by the scent of drying herbs hanging from the rafters. Sage, mint, and lavender. The table was set properly every night, even if the meal was only beans and bacon. Eli watched this transformation with a quiet, stunned wonder. He would come home, exhausted and dirty, and stand in the doorway as if he had walked into the wrong house. He would touch the curtains hesitantly. He would eat the vegetables she grew with a reverence that made Evelyn's chest tight. But there was still a distance. They slept in the same bed, but he kept to his edge, rigid and careful, terrified of imposing his roughness on her. That changed in late August. It was a moonless night. Evelyn was mending a shirt by the fire when the door burst open. Eli stumbled in, clutching his left side. He was pale beneath his tan, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Blood was soaking through the side of his duster, dark and wet. Evelyn dropped the needle and flew to him. "Eli! Horse!" "Spooked," he gritted out, leaning heavily against the doorframe. "Through me, into the ravine. Slide down some shale." "Sit down," she commanded, her voice finding that steel core she had relied on back east. "Now." She helped him to the chair, wrestling the heavy coat off his shoulders. His shirt was torn, and beneath it, his skin was scraped raw, embedded with grit and gravel. A deep gash ran along his ribs, bleeding sluggishly. It wasn't deep enough to be fatal, but it was ugly, and he had clearly ridden miles in pain. "I need hot water," she said to herself, "and whiskey." She worked efficiently, ignoring the tremor in her hands. She cleaned the wound, picking out the stones with tweezers while Eli hissed through his teeth, his knuckles white as he gripped the table edge. She poured whiskey over the cut, and he let out a low, guttural groan, his head falling back. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I know it hurts." "It is fine," he gasped. "Just stitch it." She threaded a needle with silk thread, sterilizing it in the candle flame. She stitched the skin together, her touch gentle but firm. When she was finished, she bandaged his ribs with strips of clean linen. He was shivering now, the adrenaline fading, leaving him in shock. "You need to be in bed," she said. She helped him stand. He leaned his weight on her, heavy and warm. They shuffled to the bed, and she helped him out of his boots and trousers, leaving him in his undershirt and drawers. She pulled the quilt over him. "Rest now." She turned to go back to the table to clean up the bloody rags, but his hands shot out, grabbing her wrist. His grip was shockingly strong, desperate. "Stay," he rasped. Evelyn looked down at him. His eyes were dark with pain, but also something else, a hunger he had kept leashed for months. "I am just going to put out the lamp," she said softly. "No, stay." She sat on the edge of the bed. He pulled her closer, his hand sliding up her arm to cup her elbow. His thumb traced the line of her inner arm, sending shivers racing down her spine. "You possess strength, Evelyn," he murmured, his voice thick. I watched you. With the needle. You didn't flinch. I did on the inside. No, he said. You are stronger than me. I have been terrified of you. Terrified? She almost laughed. Of me? Terrified of breaking you? He said. Terrified of making you hate this life. Hate me. He pulled her down then, ignoring the pain in his ribs. Her face hovered inches from his. She could smell the whiskey, the sweat, the copper tang of blood. It was overwhelmingly masculine, overwhelmingly real. She looked at his mouth. She thought of the way he had defended her silence, the way he had built the steps, the way he ate her vegetables as if they were holy. She lowered her head and kissed him. It was tentative at first, a question. But Eli made a sound low in his throat and kissed her back with a sudden, starving intensity. His hand tangled in her hair, pulling the pins free, letting the dark mass cascade over her shoulders. Evelyn, he groaned against her mouth. The restraint that had defined their marriage shattered. It was not the polite, mannered intimacy she had read about in novels. It was urgent, clumsy, and deeply emotional. He touched her as if he were blind and she was the only solid thing in the world. When he entered her, she gasped, not in pain, but in shock at the sheer closeness of it. He stopped, his forehead resting against hers, his breathing ragged. Profound, he whispered. You are profound. They moved together in the firelight, the shadows dancing on the log walls. It was a claiming, a binding of two lonely souls in the vast dark. Afterward, lay tangled in the sheets, the fire dying down to embers. Eli lay on his back, one arm thrown over his eyes, his chest heaving. Evelyn rested her head on his shoulder, listening to his heart hammer against his ribs. Suddenly, a sob ripped through him. Evelyn propped herself up on one elbow, alarmed. Eli? He turned his face away, shame radiating off him. He was crying, silent, racking shudders that shook the bed. Eli, what is it? Is it your ribs? No, he choked out. He grabbed her hand, pressing it to his chest, right over his heart. It is this. It is you. He turned to look at her, tears tracking through the dust and stubble on his face. He looked younger, broken open. You don't know what you married. Evelyn, you think I am just a ranch hand with a bad past. You don't know the rot I come from. You don't know the things I have buried. I married a good man, she said fiercely, wiping a tear from his cheek. I am a liar? He whispered. I am a coward hiding in the hills, and God help me, I am so afraid that when you find out, you will look at me the way they do in town, or worse. You will look at me with fear. Tell me, she said. I cannot, he said, closing his eyes. Not yet, just let me have this. Let me have you, just for a little while longer, before the world comes for us. Evelyn did not push. She felt a fierce protectiveness swell in her chest, a desire to shield this scarred, complicated man from whatever ghosts were haunting him. She kissed his forehead, his eyelids, his mouth. I'm here, she said. I am not going anywhere. That night, she did not sleep on her edge of the mattress. She slept wrapped around him, her arm thrown over his chest, holding him down to the earth. September brought no relief from the heat. The sky turned a pale, sickly white, and the rain refused to fall. The creek, usually a bubbling lifeline, dwindled to a trickle, then a series of stagnant muddy pools. The drought had arrived. The land began to crack. Fissures opened in the earth like thirsty mouths. The grass turned brittle and gray, crumbling to dust underfoot. Eli was gone for days at a time now, driving the small herd higher and higher into the mountains, searching for pockets of green in the shaded valleys. He would return gaunt, his eyes red with dust, his horse blowing hard. Evelyn fought her own war at the cabin. The well level was dropping. She had to haul water from the deepest pool in the creek bed, a mile away, to keep her garden alive. She carried 2 buckets at a time, the yoke rubbing her shoulders raw. Her hands, once soft and white, became brown and calloused. Blisters formed, broke, and formed again, turning into hard pads of skin. She stopped wearing her corset. It was too hot, too restrictive for the work. She wore a man's straw hat and wiped sweat from her brow with a rag. One afternoon, she found her prize squash plant withered, its leaves brown and crinkling. She sat in the dust and stared at it, feeling a despair so profound it frightened her. "I will not let you die," she hissed at the plant. She walked the mile to the creek. She walked back. She poured the water. She did it again. She was becoming something new. The Boston girl was gone, burned away by the sun. In her place was a woman of iron and will. Then the sickness came. It started in the mining camp north of town and swept down into Dry Bend like a prairie fire. It was a fever, high and sudden, accompanied by a racking cough. It struck the children first. Evelyn heard the news from a passing rider. The school was closed. The doctor was overwhelmed. She did not hesitate. She packed a bag with dried herbs, willow bark for fever, mullein for coughs, and food from her cellar. "You cannot go," Eli said when she told him. He was sharpening his knife by the door. "It is dangerous. You could fall ill." "I have had scarlet fever as a child." She lied, or half-lie. She had had a mild case. "I am strong, and they need help." "They treated you like a leper," Eli reminded her. His jaw set. "That does not mean I will let their children die." Evelyn said simply, "I am the teacher." "Eli, they are my charges." Eli looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Take the mare. I will ride the stallion." Evelyn spent 2 weeks in town. She converted the schoolhouse into a sick ward. She moved from cot to cot, cooling fevered brows with wet rags, spooning broth into small mouths, singing lullabies she remembered from her own nursery. The mothers, the same women who had sneered at her silk sheets, watched her with wide, frightened eyes. They saw the banker's daughter on her knees, cleaning vomit from the floor. They saw her holding the hand of the blacksmith's son as he fought for breath. They did not apologize. They were too proud for that. But the sneers vanished. One evening, Mrs. Gable brought Evelyn a cup of coffee. "You look tired, Mrs. Ward," she said gruffly. "I am fine," Evelyn said, though she was swaying on her feet. "You have a light touch," Mrs. Gable admitted, looking at the sleeping children. "My boy, he says you tell good stories." "He is a brave boy," Mrs. Gable hesitated. "That banker's girl, the one we heard about, she wouldn't have done this." "People change," Evelyn said. "Or perhaps you just never knew her," Mrs. Gable nodded once, sharp and quick. "Maybe not. It was a truce. It wasn't friendship, but it was respect." Evelyn returned to the cabin exhausted, thin, but alive. The drought finally broke in October with a violent thunderstorm that turned the dust to mud and filled the creek to bursting. Life settled into a rhythm. The winter approached, bringing snow that blanketed the canyon in silence. But it was a companionable silence now. Evelyn and Eli read by the fire in the evenings. He was teaching her to track. She was reading him Dickens. But the shadow Eli had spoken of, the rot he came from, was drawing closer. It arrived on a Tuesday in November. A blizzard was howling outside, driving snow against the north wall. Evelyn was braiding a rug by the fire when the door was kicked open. Wind and snow swirled into the room, extinguishing the candle. Eli stood in the doorway, a massive shape in his buffalo coat. He was supporting a man, or what was left of one. "Get the table clear," Eli roared, his voice terrified. Evelyn swept her sewing basket onto the floor. Eli dragged the man inside and hoisted him onto the table. The stranger was soaked in blood. He had been shot in the belly. He was older, with gray hair matted to his skull and clothes that spoke of money. Fine wool, though ruined now. "Who is he?" Evelyn cried, grabbing clean towels. "Old friend," Eli muttered, his hands working frantically to cut away the man's shirt. "Found him on the trail, just outside the ridge. He was crawling." The man groaned, a terrible, bubbling sound. He opened his eyes. They were glazed, unfocused, staring at the rafters. "The deed," the man wheezed. Blood frothed at his lips. They are coming, boy. The syndicate! New York! Hush now, Eli said, pressing a towel to the wound. Save your breath. Thomas! The man's hand shot up, gripping Eli's lapel with surprising strength. He tried to focus on Eli's face. They know you are alive, the man gasped. They know. Elias! Evelyn froze. The towel in her hand hovered over the wound. Elias, the man whispered, his voice fading. Elias Royce, you have to run. The land. Don't let them take the Royce land. The name hung in the room, louder than the storm outside. Royce. Evelyn knew that name. Everyone in the West knew that name. The Royce family had been cattle barons, kings of the territory, until a massacre 20 years ago had wiped them off the map. They were legends, a tragedy, a ghost story. She looked at her husband. Elias, was staring down at the dying man, his face a mask of stone. He did not look at Evelyn. He did not deny it. The man on the table let out one last, rattling breath, and went still. His hand slid from Eli's lapel and hung limp. Eli stood there for a long time, the blood of the dead man staining his hands. The wind howled, battering the door. Eli? Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling. He slowly lifted his head. His hazel eyes met hers, and in them, she saw the trap snapping shut. The secrets were out. The peace was over. He did not speak. He simply reached out and closed the dead man's eyes. The dead man. Thomas was buried before dawn beneath a twisted juniper tree 300 yards from the cabin. The ground was frozen hard, resisting every strike of the spade. Eli worked with a grim, mechanical rhythm, the sweat freezing on his brow despite the biting wind. Evelyn held the lantern, her hands trembling not from the cold, but from the weight of the name that had been spoken in their kitchen. Elias Royce. When the last stone was placed over the grave to deter the coyotes, Eli leaned on the shovel, his breath plumbing in the gray light. He looked at the horizon, avoiding her gaze. You asked for the truth, he said, his voice rough, like stones grinding together in a riverbed. But the truth is a disease. Evelyn, it catches everyone close to it. He called you Elias, she said. She stood wrapped in her wool shawl, the lantern light casting long, distorted shadows across the snow. He said you were a Royce, that family. They are all dead. They were slaughtered at the White Creek Massacre 20 years ago. Eli turned to her then. In the pale light of morning, he looked older, the lines around his eyes etched deep with exhaustion. Not all of them, he said softly. One ran. One coward hid in the root cellar while the house burned and his kin screamed. One boy crawled out through the smoke and ash and walked until his feet bled, then walked some more until he forgot his own name. Evelyn felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. She stepped closer, searching his face. You are the son of Jeremiah Royce. I was, Eli corrected sharply. That boy died in the fire. I am Eli Ward. I have been Eli Ward for 18 years. I have worked for every scrap of bread I have eaten. I have asked for nothing. But the land, Evelyn whispered. The Royce holdings. They were vast. The government seized them when no heirs came forward. Let them have it, Eli spat, driving the shovel into the dirt. It is cursed ground. My father died for it. My mother. He stopped, his throat working. I wanted none of it. I wanted to disappear. I thought I had... He stepped close to her, looming large in the darkness. He gripped her shoulders, his fingers digging into the wool of her coat. Listen to me, Evelyn. You cannot speak that name. Not in town, not in your sleep. There are men in Dry Bend, men who smile at you in church, who were there that night. The sheriff, the banker before your father. They carved up my father's herds before the smoke had cleared. Evelyn stared at him, horror dawning. Sheriff Miller, but he represents the law. He represents the money, Eli said bleakly. They think the last heir is dead. If they find out he is alive, if they find out he is right under their noses, they will finish the job. You must trust no one. Do you understand? No one. Evelyn looked at the fresh grave, then back at her husband. She felt a sudden, sharp stab of betrayal. He had married her under a false name. He had brought her into a house built on secrets and blood. She was not just a rancher's wife. She was the wife of a hunted man. "I understand," she said, her voice stiff. Eli dropped his hands. The distance between them, which had been closing over the last few months, suddenly yawned wide again. He looked at her with a mixture of shame and defiance. "I never wanted to drag you into this," he murmured. "I thought I was safe here. I thought the past was dead." "The past is never dead, Eli," Evelyn said, turning back toward the cabin. "It is just waiting." The weeks that followed were defined by a suffocating tension. The cabin, once a sanctuary against the cold, now felt like a fortress under siege. Eli slept with a Winchester rifle propped against the nightstand. He spent his days riding the perimeter of the canyon, checking for tracks, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgeline. Evelyn watched him. She watched the way he moved, the way his hand strayed to his hip whenever the wind banged a shutter. She felt deceived. Yes, she felt the sting of his lie every time she looked at him. But beneath the anger, there was something else, a magnetic pull born of danger. He was not the simple, slow-witted man the town mocked. He was a prince in exile, a survivor of unimaginable violence who had humbled himself to shovel manure and mend fences just to stay alive. The contrast between the rough laborer she had married and the dangerous, haunted man she now knew him to be was intoxicating. Their nights changed. The shyness was gone, replaced by a frantic, wordless urgency. When he came to bed, smelling of cold air and gun oil, Evelyn did not turn away. She met him in the dark. They clung to each other with a desperation that bordered on violence. It was not gentle lovemaking. It was an affirmation of survival. Every time he touched her, it was as if he were checking to make sure she was still there, still real, still his. But they did not speak of the dead man. They did not speak of the name Royce. It lay between them like a loaded weapon on the table. In early December, Evelyn rode into town for supplies. The snow had packed down to a hard, slick surface, and the air was crisp. She needed flour and coffee. But more than that, she needed to see the faces of the people Eli had warned her about. She walked into the general store, her chin held high. The bell above the door chimed, cutting through the murmur of conversation. Sheriff Miller was standing by the stove, warming his hands. He was a heavy man with a thick gray mustache and eyes that always seemed to be calculating the value of whatever they looked at. When he saw Evelyn, he tipped his hat. "Mrs. Ward," he said jovially, "how is winter treating you up in the canyon? We haven't seen Eli in weeks." Evelyn felt her heart hammer against her ribs. He was there, she thought. He might have lit the match. "My husband is busy with the stock." "Sheriff," she said, her voice cool and steady, "the weather keeps us close to home." "A wise policy," Miller said, his eyes lingering on her face a fraction of a second too long. "Though a man can't hide from the world forever. Eventually, he has to come down from the mountain." Was it a threat, or just small talk? Evelyn couldn't tell. She moved to the counter, placing her order with Mrs. Gable. As she waited for her parcel, the door opened again. Clara, the sheriff's daughter, swept in, shaking snow from a fur-lined cloak that was far too expensive for a lawman's salary. She saw Evelyn, and her lip curled. "Well," Clara announced to the room, "if it isn't the hermit's bride, I'm surprised Eli let you off the leash. Evelyn, I heard he guards that shack of yours like there is gold buried under the floorboards." The few customers in the store chuckled. Evelyn took her package, turning to leave. "Good day, Clara." Clara stepped into her path. Her eyes were bright with malice. She had never forgiven Eli for ignoring her, and she had never forgiven Evelyn for being the one he chose. "You think you are better than us because you read books and use big words," Clara hissed, lowering her voice so only those nearby could hear. "But you married a killer. Evelyn, did he ever tell you why he drifted into town with blood on his coat 5 years ago? He killed a man over a card game in Abilene. Everyone knows it." Evelyn stopped. The accusation was absurd. Eli didn't gamble, but the venom behind it was real. "That is a lie," Evelyn said quietly. "Is it?" Clara stepped closer, smelling of rosewater and spite. Ask him. Ask him about the blood. Or maybe you don't care. Maybe you are just desperate to keep a roof over your head, even if it belongs to a murderer. The store had gone silent. Every eye was on them. Evelyn looked at Clara, at her smug, pretty, vicious face, and saw the face of the town that had tormented them for months. Without thinking, Evelyn raised her hand and struck Clara across the face. The sound was a sharp crack, like a dry branch snapping. Clara's head snapped to the side. She stumbled back, clutching her cheek, her eyes wide with shock. "My husband," Evelyn said, her voice ringing in the silence, "is a better man than any who stands in this room. Do not speak his name again." She swept past the stunned woman and walked out the door. Her hand was stinging, her breath coming in short gasps. She climbed into the wagon and snapped the reins, driving the mare hard out of town. She did not look back. She felt a fierce, terrifying pride burning in her chest. She had chosen her side. 2 days later, the stranger arrived. He did not look like the rough men of Dry Bend. He wore a long gray coat made of fine wool, a bowler hat, and boots that were polished to a high shine. He arrived on the stagecoach and took a room above the saloon. He drank expensive whiskey and bought rounds for the locals, asking polite, probing questions. He asked about land deeds. He asked about old property lines. And, as the sun began to set on his second day, he asked about a man named Elias Royce. News traveled fast in the high country. By the time Evelyn returned from gathering wood that evening, Eli was already pacing the small floor of the cabin. He looked like a caged animal. "There is a man in town," Evelyn said, dropping the wood by the stove. "I saw the smoke from the livery signals. Someone rode up to warn the line shack." "I know," Eli said. He stopped pacing and looked at her. His face was pale beneath the tan. "He was asking for me." "For Eli Ward?" "No, for Elias Royce." Evelyn went to him, taking his rough hands in hers. They were ice cold. "Who is he?" "Eli." "His name is Blackwood," Eli said. "He is a lawyer from New York. He works for the Union Pacific, but behind them is a syndicate of investors. Men who buy land by the county, not the acre." "Why now?" Evelyn asked. "After 20 years?" "Because the railroad is coming," Eli said. "They are surveying a new line through the territory, and the only pass that stays clear of snow in the winter runs straight through the heart of the Royce claim." He pulled his hands away and went to the loose floorboard under the bed, the one Evelyn had seen him checking a dozen times but never questioned. He pried it up with his knife and pulled out a heavy, oilskin-wrapped packet. He brought it to the table and unfolded it. It was a map, old and brittle, drawn on vellum with ink that had faded to brown. "This," Eli said, tracing a line with a trembling finger, "is what they killed my family for, not just the cattle. This—" Evelyn leaned in. The map showed the familiar peaks of the range, but tucked behind a jagged ridge that looked impassable was a valley. It was marked with the initials J.R.R. "The Hidden Valley," Eli whispered. "My father found it 40 years ago. It is a natural basin, thousands of acres of virgin timber, a lake fed by snowmelt that never goes dry, gold in the creek beds. It is a kingdom, Evelyn, and it is the only flat road through these mountains for 50 miles. Evelyn looked at the map, then at her husband. "And you are the heir. It belongs to you. It belongs to the dead," Eli said bitterly. "I never wanted it. I saw what greed did to men. I saw it turn neighbors into butchers. I walked away from a fortune because I wanted to sleep at night without a gun under my pillow." He looked up at her, his eyes wet. "I didn't want to be rich, Evelyn. I just wanted peace. I wanted a life where no one knew my name and no one looked at me with dollar signs in their eyes. I wanted to be simple." "But you are not simple," Evelyn said softly, "and the world will not let you be." "They want the deed," Eli said. "Blackwood is here to find the heir, buy him off, or bury him." "If he finds out I am here, if he finds out I have the deed?" "He will come for us." "Yes." Eli slumped into the chair, burying his face in his hands. "I should burn it," I should burn the deed and the map and leave this place. We could go to California, start over. Evelyn looked at the man she loved, this strong, broken man who had carried the weight of a massacre alone for 2 decades. She thought of the way the town treated him. She thought of Clara's sneer. She thought of the hard, unforgiving dirt she had forced to yield a garden. She thought of the baby she secretly suspected was beginning to grow in her womb. She reached out and placed her hand over the map. "No," she said. Eli looked up, startled. "We do not run," Evelyn said, her voice hardening. "You ran once, Eli, and it brought you here, to a shack in the wind, hiding like a criminal. If we run now, we will run forever. Evelyn, they are powerful men. They have hired guns. And you are Elias Royce," she said. "This is your land. This is our home. I will not let them take it. I will not let them win." She saw the conflict warring in his eyes, the fear for her safety clashing with the dormant pride of his bloodline. "It will be a war," he warned. "Then let it be war." The wind howled outside, shaking the door on its hinges. The fire popped in the stove. The atmosphere in the room shifted. The fear was still there, but it had transmuted into something else, something electric and volatile. Eli stood up. He looked at her not as a protector, but as a man looking at his equal. The air between them crackled. "You are a dangerous woman, Evelyn Carr." He breathed. "I am Evelyn Ward," she corrected him. She walked to the bed. She did not look away from him. With steady fingers, she began to undo the buttons of her bodice. She let the dress fall to the floor. She unlaced her corset, dropping it atop the wool. She stood before him in her chemise, the firelight glowing on her skin, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. "You said you wanted peace," she said, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a sudden, overwhelming desire. She climbed into the bed, pulling the quilt back. Her eyes locked on his. "Come here, Eli." He stood frozen, watching her. "Show me," she commanded softly. "Show me what peace feels like." Eli made a low sound, like a man breaking. He crossed the room in 2 strides. He did not blow out the lantern this time. He wanted to see her. He stripped off his shirt, revealing the scars that mapped his body, the old bullet wound on his shoulder, the burns from a branding iron, the history of pain written on his skin. He came to her, not with the tentative reverence of their early marriage, but with a hunger that matched her own. When he kissed her, it tasted of desperation and defiance. Evelyn met him force for force. She wrapped her legs around him, pulling him down, anchoring him to the mattress, to the earth, to her. "Evelyn," he groaned against her neck, his hands gripping her hips, leaving bruises that she would wear like medals. "I am here," she whispered fiercely. "I am right here." They made love with a rawness neither expected. It was a reclaiming. It was a shedding of the lies and the silence. There was no simple man in the bed that night. There was only Elias Royce, the king of the high country, and the woman who had the courage to crown him. They moved together in the golden light, sweat slicking their skin, their breath mingling in the cold air. It was a frantic, consuming union, driven by the knowledge that death was waiting in the valley below. But for this moment, in this small wooden room, they were alive, they were powerful, and they were one. When it was over, Eli collapsed against her, his face buried in the curve of her neck. Evelyn stroked his damp hair, her eyes fixed on the ceiling beams. She felt the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her own. She looked at the map still lying open on the table, the hidden valley. Let them come, she thought, feeling a cold, hard resolve settle in her gut. Let the stranger come. Let the sheriff come. They would find that Eli Ward was gone, and Elias Royce had returned. The morning sun bled cold and pale over the rim of the canyon, illuminating the map that still lay open on the rough-hewn table. To Evelyn, the inked lines looked like veins, a circulatory system of a ghost that refused to die. "It is not just land." "Eli," she said, her voice tight with the lack of sleep. She stood by the stove, gripping a mug of coffee as if it were a weapon. "It is justice. If you burn this map, you let them win. You let the men who murdered your family keep the world they stole." Eli sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. He looked exhausted, the previous night's passion replaced by the crushing weight of daylight reality. "Justice is a word for people who can afford lawyers. Evelyn," he said, his voice muffled. "Out here, there is only survival. You want me to walk into the territory office and declare myself Elias Royce? The moment I sign that paper, I put a target on your back." "The target is already there!" Evelyn slammed the mug down on the table, coffee sloshing over the rim. "That man, Blackwood, is in town asking questions. The sheriff is watching us. They suspect Eli. Hiding in this shack will not save us. Power will save us. Ownership will save us." Eli stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loud against the floorboards. He towered over her, his eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and fear. "You think ownership protects you?" he demanded. "My father owned more land than God. He had papers. He had the law. And I watched them drag him out into the yard and shoot him like a sick dog. Money does not stop a bullet. Evelyn, it just buys a more expensive coffin." "So we do nothing?" she challenged, stepping into his space, refusing to be cowed. "We wait for them to come up here and burn us out?" "We leave," Eli said. "We pack the horses. We ride west. Oregon, California. Somewhere nobody cares about the name Royce." "I will not run," Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a whisper that was harder than stone. "I spent my whole life running from my father's shame. I will not run from yours." Eli looked at her, his jaw working. He reached out, almost touching her face, then pulled back. He grabbed his coat and hat. "I have fences to mend," he said flatly. He walked out into the biting wind, leaving her alone with the map and the ghosts. Evelyn waited until he was gone, riding south toward the ridge, before she saddled the mare. Her hands were steady as she tightened the cinch. She wore her heavy wool cloak and concealed a small derringer, a relic from her Boston days, in her pocket. She rode into Dry Bend with a singular purpose. The town was quiet, huddling against the winter chill. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys. Evelyn tied the mare outside the small, dusty office of Thaddeus Finch, the town's only solicitor. Finch was a relic of a man, older than the town itself, with skin like parchment and eyes that watered perpetually. He looked up from a stack of papers as Evelyn entered, the bell above the door jingling softly. "Mrs. Ward," he croaked, adjusting his spectacles. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Eli finally decided to make a will?" "Not exactly. Mr. Finch," Evelyn said, closing the door against the wind. She sat in the chair opposite him, keeping her back straight. "I have a curiosity. I'm a teacher, as you know, and I have been reading about the history of the territory. I came across a name." Finch wiped his nose with a handkerchief. "We have plenty of names in these parts. Most of them are on tombstones." "The Royce family," Evelyn said. The old man went still. The handkerchief paused halfway to his pocket. The air in the room seemed to thicken. "Why would you ask about them?" Finch asked, his voice suddenly devoid of its wheezing warmth. "Curiosity," Evelyn repeated, lying smoothly. "I heard a story that their estate was never settled, that it was lost." Finch leaned forward, his watery eyes narrowing. "It was not lost, Mrs. Ward. It was erased. Jeremiah Royce held the deed to 50,000 acres, including the Blind Pass and the valley beyond, prime timber, water rights. And what happened to it? The massacre," Finch whispered. "Everyone died. No heirs. The territory seized the grazing lands. But the deed to the valley itself was never found. Some say Jeremiah hid it. Some say the boy took it. The boy, Elias, 7 years old. They never found his body." Finch looked at the door, then back at Evelyn. "Listen to me, girl. Do not go digging in that grave. The Royce claim is a ghost story, and the men who wrote the ending are still holding the pen." "Is the claim still valid?" Evelyn pressed. "If an heir existed?" Finch laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Valid. It is ironclad. That deed was a federal grant. Whoever holds it owns the key to the entire territory. That is why the railroad wants it. That is why the syndicate is sniffing around. He leaned in close. And that is why that boy, if he is alive, is a dead man walking. Evelyn stood up, her heart hammering. Thank you, Mr. Finch. It was just a story. Be careful, Mrs. Ward, Finch warned as she reached for the handle. Curiosity killed more than just the cat in this town. Evelyn walked out into the cold sunlight, her mind racing. It was real, the fortune was real, and the danger was absolute. She needed to buy thread, a pretext for her trip, so she forced herself to walk to the general store. As she browsed the spools of cotton, she felt a presence beside her. Mrs. Ward. It was the stranger, Blackwood. Up close, he smelled of expensive bay rum and stale cigar smoke. His suit was impeccable, his smile practiced and entirely without warmth. Mr. She feigned ignorance. Blackwood, Arthur Blackwood. I represent interests in New York. He picked up a spool of red ribbon, turning it over in his gloved fingers. I understand you are a woman of education, Mrs. Ward. It must be difficult, living in such rustic conditions. After Boston, Evelyn stiffened. He had checked her background. I find the air here agrees with me, Mr. Blackwood. I am sure, he smiled. But surely, a woman of your breeding worries about the future. Ranching is a precarious business. Accidents happen, droughts, fires. The threat was veiled, but unmistakable. We manage, she said coldly. Blackwood stepped closer, invading her space. I am authorized to make generous offers for land in this area, even land with complicated histories. If you and your husband were to consider moving, perhaps back east, where you belong, I could facilitate a payment of $5,000. Cash. $5,000. It was a fortune. It was enough to live in comfort for the rest of their lives. My husband is not interested in selling, Evelyn said. Your husband is a simple man, Blackwood said, his voice dropping to a silken purr. Perhaps he does not understand the complexity of the situation. Perhaps he does not know that some debts from the past come due with interest. You should convince him, Mrs. Ward, for his own safety, and yours. Evelyn looked him in the eye. My husband understands more than you think, and we are not for sale. She turned and walked away, leaving him standing by the ribbons, his smile gone. The violence came 3 nights later. The wind had died down, leaving a silence so heavy it felt suffocating. Evelyn and Eli were eating supper in a tense quiet. The argument about the land had not been resolved. It had simply gone underground, a river of magma flowing beneath their daily routines. Suddenly, the horses in the corral screamed. It was a sound of pure terror, high and piercing. Eli dropped his fork, his head snapping up. Stay here, he ordered. He grabbed the Winchester from the corner and threw open the door. A wall of heat hit them. The barn, the small, rickety structure where they kept the winter hay and the tools, was ablaze. Flames licked up the dry timber, turning the night sky a bruised orange. No, Evelyn cried, running to the door. Stay back, Eli shouted. He ran toward the fire. As he crossed the yard, 2 shadows detached themselves from the darkness near the trough. They were men, their faces covered with flour sacks, eye holes cut crudely. One of them raised a pistol and fired. The shot cracked through the valley. Dirt kicked up near Eli's boot. He didn't flinch. He didn't break stride. He raised the rifle stock to his shoulder and fired in a single fluid motion. The man with the pistol yelled, spinning around, clutching his arm. The second man charged Eli, tackling him before he could chamber another round. The rifle flew from Eli's hands. They hit the frozen ground with a bone-jarring thud, rolling in the mud and snow. Evelyn watched, paralyzed with horror. The fire roared, casting chaotic shadows over the struggle. The man on top of Eli was big, wielding a heavy club. He brought it down, but Eli caught his wrist. Evelyn saw her husband then, not as the quiet rancher, but as the survivor of a massacre. He fought with a vicious, desperate efficiency. He twisted the man's wrist with a sickening crack, drove his knee into the man's groin, and rolled him over. He punched the attacker. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound of fist-meeting flesh was wet and awful. The first man, the one who had been shot, scrambled to his feet, clutching his bleeding arm. "Leave him! Let's go!" The attacker beneath Eli kicked out, catching Eli in the chest, knocking him back. The 2 men scrambled toward the darkness where their horses were tethered. Eli reached for his rifle, but they were already mounting. Hooves thundered against the hard earth as they galloped away into the night. "Eli!" Evelyn ran to him. He was on his knees, gasping for breath, blood streaming from a cut above his eye. "I am fine," he wheezed, spitting pink spittle into the snow. "Check the barn. The horses." Evelyn ran to the corral. The gate had been opened. Their own horses were huddled in the far corner of the pasture, terrified but unharmed. The barn, however, was a loss. The dry hay was consumed. The roof collapsed with a shower of sparks as she watched. She walked back to Eli. He was still kneeling in the mud, staring at something in his hand. "What is it?" she asked, dropping to her knees beside him. He opened his palm. Lying there, gleaming in the firelight, was a heavy gold ring. It must have slipped from the attacker's finger during the struggle. It was a signet ring. On the face was an engraving of a steam engine crossing a shield. "The Union Pacific," Evelyn whispered. "The Syndicate." Eli closed his hand over the ring, his fist shaking. "They are not asking anymore. Evelyn, they are not negotiating." He looked at the burning barn. The firelight illuminated the scar on his neck, making it look angry and fresh. "They know," he said. "They might not know I am Elias, but they know I am in the way, and they know where we live." "We cannot stay here tonight," Evelyn said, pulling him to his feet. "No," Eli said. He looked at the mountains, black shapes against the stars. "We go to the valley. Now? Now. If we are to die, I will not die in a shack. I will die on my own ground." They packed what they could carry in saddlebags, blankets, ammunition, dried meat, the map. They left the wagon. The terrain they were heading into would break wheels. They rode out under the cover of darkness, Eli leading the way. He did not take the main trail. He guided them through game trails and dry creek beds, doubling back, erasing their tracks where the ground was soft. They climbed for hours. The air grew thin and biting. Snow began to fall, soft and silent, covering their passage. Evelyn was exhausted, her legs aching from the saddle, but the fear kept her awake. She watched Eli's back. He rode with a new bearing now. He was no longer the hunch-shouldered laborer. He was riding home. Just as dawn began to bleed gray into the sky, they reached a narrow fissure in the rock face, a split in the granite so tight 2 riders could barely pass abreast. It looked like nothing, a shadow on the cliff. "The blind pass," Eli said. His voice hushed. He led her through. The passage twisted, blocking out the sky, before opening suddenly onto a vista that stole the breath from Evelyn's lungs. It was a bowl in the mountains, sheltered from the wind, a vast, high-altitude valley, green with hardy spruce and pine, dusted with pristine snow. A lake sat in the center, a mirror of black glass. It was wild, untouched, and achingly beautiful. "My God," Evelyn whispered. "It has its own weather," Eli said softly. "The cliffs protect it. The water comes from a hot spring deep underground. It never fully freezes." They rode down into the basin. As they neared the edge of the lake, Evelyn saw them, ruins. The stone chimney of a massive house stood like a tombstone in the center of a clearing. Charred beams, preserved by the dry mountain air, lay crossed like bones. The foundation was overgrown with sagebrush, but the outline of a grand estate was still visible. Eli stopped his horse. He sat there for a long time, just looking. Then he slid from the saddle. His legs seemed to give out, and he fell to his knees in the snow. Evelyn dismounted and ran to him. "Eli," he was weeping. Not the silent tears of the bedroom, but great, heaving sobs that seemed to tear his body apart. He was a child again, standing in the ashes of his life. I can smell it. He choked out. I can still smell the smoke. Evelyn knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around his shoulders. Tell me everything. He gripped her hands, his knuckles white. It was the town elders, he rasped. Miller, Finch, Thorne. They came at night, just like tonight. They wanted the deed. My father refused. He tried to fight. Eli squeezed his eyes shut. His face contorted in agony. They shot him on the porch. I was hiding in the pantry. I saw it through the crack in the door. And my mother. His voice broke, shattering into a whisper of pure horror. She screamed for him to stop. Miller. He laughed. They took her into the parlor. I heard everything. Evelyn, I heard her beg. I heard her stop begging. Evelyn pulled him against her chest, rocking him as he shook. Tears streamed down her own face. This was the rot he had spoken of. This was the darkness at the heart of the town that had mocked her for marrying a simple man. They set the fire to cover their sins. Eli wept. I crawled out the window. I ran into the timber. I watched it burn. I watched them ride away, laughing. You survived, Evelyn whispered fiercely into his hair. You survived them. I died there, he said. Elias Royce died in that fire. I am just the ghost he left behind. No, she said. She took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. You are flesh and blood. You are my husband, and you are the master of this valley. They stayed there for a long time, kneeling in the snow amidst the ruins of his past. The sun rose higher, bathing the tragic landscape in a brilliant, indifferent light. Finally, the tears stopped. Eli stood up, pulling Evelyn with him. He looked at the chimney, then at the lake, then at her. The grief was still there, but the shame was gone. It had been spoken. It had been shared. Come, he said quietly. They made camp near the hot springs, where the ground was warm. They didn't try to build a shelter. They simply laid their bedrolls on the earth, under the vast canopy of the sky. That night, under the stars, they did not make love. They simply held each other. Evelyn lay with her back to his chest, his arms wrapped around her like bands of iron. She felt his breath on her neck, steady and warm. We will build it back, she whispered into the dark, stone by stone. It will take a lifetime, he murmured. We have a lifetime. They stayed in the valley for 2 days. It was a strange, suspended time, a honeymoon stolen from the jaws of hell. Eli showed her the timber stands. He showed her where he had fished as a boy. He reconnected with the land that was his birthright. But they knew they could not stay. They had no food, no supplies, and the war had already begun. They rode back down the mountain in silence, descending from the dream back into the nightmare. When they reached the cabin, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. The smell of wet ash from the burned barn was still heavy in the air. Evelyn gasped as they rode into the clearing. The cabin door was hanging off its hinges. The windows were smashed. Eli leaped from his horse, rifle in hand, but the yard was empty. They walked inside. It was total devastation. The furniture was overturned. The mattress was slashed, feathers covering the floor like snow. Evelyn's garden, her precious, hard-won garden, had been trampled by horses. The winter vegetables crushed into the mud. Her books were torn apart, pages scattered across the room. Her clothes were shredded. It was a violation. It was a message that said, "You have nothing. We can touch you anywhere." Eli walked to the far wall. He stood very still. Evelyn followed his gaze, burned into the wood of the log wall, scorched black with a hot poker, were words in jagged, angry letters. Give it up, Royce. They knew his name. There was no more hiding. Evelyn felt a wave of nausea. She reached out to steady herself against the table, which was lying on its side. Eli turned to her. His face was terrifyingly calm. The fear she had seen in him for months was gone, replaced by a cold, lethal clarity. He looked at the ruined home, at the trampled garden, and finally at his wife. He walked over to her and holstered the pistol at his hip. He reached out and brushed a stray feather from her hair. "They want a war," he said softly. They want the Royce legacy. He walked to the corner where a loose floorboard had been pried up and discarded by the intruders. They had looked for the deed, but they hadn't found it, because it was in Eli's saddlebag. He turned back to the door, looking out toward the town that lay in the distance, the town that had killed his parents, mocked his wife, and burned his home. "I am going to kill them," Eli said. "I am going to kill them all." "Eli," Evelyn said, stepping forward. "Not just bullets. We need the law. We need the marshals." "The law is bought," he said. "The marshals are days away." "Then we buy time," she said. "But we do not die here. We fight." Eli looked at her, his eyes burning with a blue flame. "I swore I would protect you," he said. "I failed to protect this house. I failed to protect your peace." He pulled the Winchester from his scabbard and racked the lever, the metallic clack-clack sounding loud in the ruined room. "But I will not fail you again. Evelyn, if they want the land, they can have it, but they will have to climb over a mountain of brass to get it." The days that followed the destruction of their home were not measured in hours, but in the grim, metallic rhythm of preparation. The cabin, once a place of tentative domesticity, was transformed into a fortress. The windows, shattered by the intruders, were boarded up with thick planks of oak Eli had dragged from the wood pile. The door was reinforced with iron bands he forged himself in the coals of the stove. Eli moved through the wreckage with a terrifying singularity of purpose. He was no longer the quiet ranch hand who mended steps and carved hairpins. He was a soldier returning to a war he had tried to desert. He rode out at dawn, not to tend cattle, but to scout the perimeter. He set tripwires made of blackened twine across the narrow approaches to the canyon, rigging them to cowbells stuffed with rags so they would give a dull, thumping warning rather than a bright chime that might alert the enemy. He cleaned his Winchester rifle 3 times a day, the smell of gun oil replacing the scent of baking bread in the kitchen. "They will come at night," Eli told Evelyn as he loaded shells onto the table, his thumb pressing each brass cartridge into the loop of his belt. "Cowards always come at night. They want the dark to hide their faces." Evelyn watched him, her heart a knot of cold fear. "We cannot fight the whole town alone. Eli, we need allies." "We have no allies," he replied without looking up. "The town belongs to the syndicate now. Fear is a powerful currency, and Blackwood has spent a lot of it." "I do not believe that," Evelyn said, grabbing her cloak. "There are good people in Dry Bend, God-fearing people. They will not stand by and watch a murder." "Evelyn, I am going to the church," she stated, tying her bonnet with fingers that refused to tremble. "I am going to speak to Reverend Thomas. If there is any sanctuary left in this world, it must be there." She took the mare, leaving Eli to his grim work. The ride to town was cold, the wind biting through her wool coat. When she arrived, the streets were eerily quiet. People watched her from behind curtained windows. They knew, the whole town knew that the war had started, and they were hiding to avoid the crossfire. Reverend Thomas was in the vestry, polishing a brass candlestick. He was a soft, round man who preferred sermons on forgiveness rather than judgment. When Evelyn entered, he nearly dropped the candlestick. "Mrs. Ward," he stammered. We did not expect to see you. My home was destroyed." "Reverend," Evelyn said, her voice echoing in the small, cold room. "My husband is being hunted by men hired by the railroad. They intend to kill him for land that is rightfully his. I am asking for help. I am asking for sanctuary, or at least for you to stand with us. If a man of God stands on our porch, perhaps they will hesitate." The Reverend looked at his shoes. He wiped a speck of dust from the brass. "It is a complicated matter, Mrs. Ward," he murmured. "Land disputes, legal troubles. The church cannot interfere in secular affairs." "This is not a secular affair," Evelyn cried, stepping forward. "It is a matter of life and death. It is Cain and Abel. Reverend, do you not preach that we must defend the innocent?" "Is he innocent?" The Reverend looked up, his eyes pleading with her to leave. They say he is a Royce. They say that blood calls to blood. Sheriff Miller says your husband is a danger to the peace of this community. Sheriff Miller is a thief and a liar." Evelyn spat. "Lower your voice, please!" The Reverend looked toward the door, terrified. "Mrs. Ward, I cannot help you. The church roof needs repairs. The donation from Mr. Blackwood." It was substantial. "I have a flock to protect." Evelyn stared at him. She saw the sweat beading on his upper lip. She saw the cowardice rotting him from the inside out. "You have no flock, Reverend," she said, her voice trembling with icy rage. "You have only customers, and Judas was paid in silver, not roof shingles." She turned and walked out, leaving him standing in the dust of his own shame. She walked the length of the town, her head high, though her spirit was crumbling. She passed the general store, where Mrs. Gable turned the sign to closed as she approached. She passed the saloon, where rough men watched her with predatory eyes. She felt the total, crushing isolation of their position. Eli was right. They were alone. She was unhitching the mare when a voice grumbled from the shadows of the livery stable. "Heard you were looking for a fight, Miss Carr." She turned. Standing in the doorway of the forge was Jebediah Stone. He was the town blacksmith, a man of 60 winters with arms like knotted oak roots and a beard singed by sparks. He wore a leather apron that looked as old as the territory itself. He had lost an eye in the war between the states, and the patch he wore gave him a piratical, terrifying appearance. "I am looking for help, Mr. Stone," Evelyn said, weary to her bones. "But it seems courage is in short supply in Dry Bend." Jebediah spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. He limped forward, wiping his massive hands on a rag. "Preacher Thomas has a spine made of custard." Jebediah grunted. "And Miller. Well, Miller has been crooked since he wore diapers." He looked at Evelyn, his one good eye, sharp and intelligent. "Is it true?" he asked. "Is he Jeremiah's boy? Is he the little one that ran?" Evelyn hesitated. Trust was a dangerous thing, but she looked at the old man's face and saw no greed there, only a craggy, stubborn curiosity. "Yes," she said. "He is Elias Royce." Jebediah let out a long, low whistle. He looked toward the mountains. "I showed Jeremiah's horses for 20 years, the blacksmith said softly. "He was a hard man, but he paid fair, and he never looked down on a man for having dirt under his fingernails. I was there that night, afterward, helped bury what was left." He looked back at Evelyn. "I swore if I ever found the men who did it, I would put a hammer through their skulls, but I never knew it was the town council until years later. By then, I was old and they were rich. They are coming for him tonight," Evelyn said. "To finish it." Jebediah nodded slowly. He turned back into the dark maw of his shop. He rummaged around for a moment and came back carrying a double-barreled shotgun that looked like a cannon. "I ain't got much to live for," Jebediah said. "My wife is on the ground and my boys are gone. I reckon I have one good fight left in me." He climbed onto the buckboard wagon parked nearby. "Well, are we riding? Or are we waiting for the snow to melt?" Evelyn felt a sob catch in her throat. She nodded, unable to speak, and mounted the mare. The sun began to dip behind the peaks, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and blood red. The wind died down, leaving a silence that felt heavy, charged with static. Back at the cabin, Eli looked at Jebediah Stone with shock. "You," Eli said. "Me." Jebediah grunted, checking the load in his shotgun. "You got your daddy's chin, boy, and his stubbornness, by the looks of it. You don't have to do this. Jeb, it is not your war. It became my war when they burned a house with a woman inside it," Jebediah said, nodding at Evelyn. "Now shut up and tell me where you want me." They established a perimeter. Jebediah took up a position in the ruins of the barn, hidden behind a stone trough that had survived the fire. It gave him a clear line of sight to the creek bed. Eli and Evelyn remained in the cabin. As the last light faded, the waiting began. It was a torture all its own. Every snap of a twig, every hoot of an owl sounded like a footstep. Eli blew out the lantern. The room was plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the embers in the stove. "Evelyn," he whispered. She went to him, He was standing by the window, peering through a crack in the boards. He turned and pulled her into his arms. His grip was bruising, desperate. "If they breach the door," he said, his voice ragged, "you go out the back window. You run for the high timber. You do not look back. Do you understand?" "I am not leaving you," she whispered fiercely. "Evelyn, please. If I die, I die. But if they take you—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The thought terrified him more than any bullet. "We live together, or we die together," she said. She reached up, her hands finding his face in the dark. She traced the line of his jaw, the rough stubble, the scar on his neck. The fear in the room shifted, condensed, and ignited into something else. It was a primal need to affirm life in the face of death. He kissed her. It was not gentle. It tasted of salt and iron. He lifted her onto the table, pushing aside the boxes of ammunition. There was no time for undressing, no time for tenderness. He pressed against her, urgent and starving. "Evelyn," he groaned, burying his face in her neck. She held him, her fingers tangling in his hair, pulling him closer. They moved together in the dark, a frantic, heated tangle of limbs and breath. It was a claim, a defiance. "I am here. I am alive. You cannot take this from me." When it was over, they stood forehead to forehead, breathing hard in the silence. The intimacy had stripped away the last of the pretense. They were two souls standing on the edge of the world. "I love you," Eli whispered. It was the first time he had said the words. "I know," she answered. Then, the cowbell in the canyon gave a dull thunk. They froze. "They are here," Eli said. He picked up the Winchester. He handed Evelyn the heavy revolver he had taken from the mantel. "Stay low. Don't fire unless they come through the door." Outside, the night erupted. A torch arced through the air, landing on the porch. Then another. The dry wood of the steps caught instantly. "Flush him out!" a voice roared from the darkness. Eli smashed the glass of the window with his rifle butt and fired. The muzzle flash lit up the room for a split second. A scream echoed from the trees. "They are in the trees!" Eli shouted. Gunfire erupted from 3 directions. Bullets slammed into the logs of the cabin, sending splinters flying. The sound was deafening, a chaotic thunder that shook the floorboards. From the barn, a boom like a cannon blast answered. "Jebediah's shotgun!" "That's for the barn!" the old blacksmith yelled. Eli worked the lever of his rifle, firing, racking, firing. He was a machine. He wasn't aiming at shapes. He was aiming at muzzle flashes. "Burn them out!" the voice commanded again. A man broke cover, running toward the cabin with a bundle of burning pitch. Eli shifted his aim. He fired. The man jerked violently, his legs folding under him. He fell face first into the snow, the torch rolling harmlessly away. "Man down!" someone screamed. "Pull back! Pull back!" The attackers had expected a terrified rancher and a helpless woman. They had not expected a fortified position and a crossfire. Another blast from the barn. A horse whinnied in pain. "Retreat! Get the horses!" The gunfire sputtered and died. The sound of galloping hooves faded into the distance. Silence rushed back into the canyon, ringing in their ears. "Is it over?" Evelyn whispered, clutching the revolver with both hands. "Stay here," Eli commanded. He kicked the door open and stepped out onto the burning porch. He kicked the flaming brand into the snow. "Jeb!" he shouted. "I'm here," the blacksmith called back. "One of them ain't moving. The other 2 run like scalded cats." Eli walked down the steps, his rifle raised. He approached the body in the snow. He turned the man over with his boot. It was a stranger, a hired gun. The signet ring man? No, he was too young. Just a thug paid $20 to commit murder. Eli felt a cold, sick rage. They were just pawns. The kings were still sitting safe in town. Suddenly, the sound of more horses approached. Many horses. "Eli!" Evelyn cried from the doorway. "More is coming!" Eli spun around, raising his rifle, but these riders carried lanterns, not torches. The light revealed the glint of tin stars. Sheriff Miller rode into the yard, flanked by 4 deputies. He looked at the burning porch. The dead man in the snow, and Eli standing over him with a smoking rifle. "Drop the weapon! Ward!" Miller shouted, drawing his own pistol. "Sheriff!" Evelyn ran out. "Thank God! They attacked us! They tried to burn the house!" Miller ignored her. He kept his gun trained on Eli. "I said drop it, or I will cut you down where you stand." Eli hesitated. He looked at Miller's eyes. There was no justice there, only triumph. Slowly, Eli lowered the rifle and let it drop to the snow. "Seize him," Miller ordered. 2 deputies jumped down and rushed Eli. They slammed him against the side of the cabin, twisting his arms behind his back. They shackled his wrists with heavy iron cuffs. "What are you doing?" Evelyn screamed. Running forward, she grabbed Miller's stirrup. "He was defending his home. That man," she pointed to the body, "tried to kill us." Miller looked down at her with a sneer. "All I see is a dead man and a known troublemaker holding a gun. That is murder. Mrs. Ward, it is self-defense. That is for a judge to decide." Miller said, "If he lives that long, we are taking him to the county lockup. You are lucky I didn't arrest you as an accessory." "Jeb saw it," Evelyn cried. "Jebediah Stone was here. He saw everything." Miller looked toward the barn where Jeb was emerging, his shotgun lowered. "Old Jeb?" Miller laughed. "The man is half-blind and senile. His word won't hold up in court against the law." Miller looked at Eli. "Get him on a horse." "Evelyn," Eli said, his voice calm despite the violence of the deputies handling him. "Don't fight them. Not here. Eli, go inside," he commanded. "Lock the door." They hauled him onto a spare horse. Miller tipped his hat to Evelyn, a gesture of supreme mockery. "Try to stay warm. Mrs. Ward, it is going to be a long winter." They rode away, taking Eli with them into the dark. Evelyn stood in the snow, the heat of the dying fire on her face, watching the lanterns fade. She felt a scream building in her chest, but she swallowed it down. Jebediah walked up beside her. He spat on the ground. "They won't let him see a judge," the old man said grimly. "They will hang him in his cell and say he committed suicide. Or they will let a lynch mob break in." Evelyn turned. Her eyes were dry. Her face was a mask of stone. "No," she said. "They will not." The jail cell was a stone box that smelled of urine and despair. Eli sat on the cot, his head in his hands. His face was bruised from where the deputies had subdued him during the ride. When the door opened, he didn't look up. He assumed it was Miller coming to taunt him. "Eli." He jerked his head up. Evelyn stood on the other side of the bars. She was pale, her dress covered in travel dust, but she was there. "You shouldn't have come," he rasped, standing up and gripping the bars. "It isn't safe. I brought you food," she said, passing a cloth-wrapped bundle through the bars. "And blankets." "Evelyn, listen to me," Eli said, his voice low and urgent. "Miller was here an hour ago. He told me the circuit judge isn't due for 3 weeks. They aren't going to wait. Blackwood is in the office right now, drinking whiskey with him. I can hear them laughing." "I know," she said. "You have to leave." Eli said, "Pack the deed. Pack the gold locket. Go to your cousin in Oregon." "If I die—" "Stop it," she hissed. She reached through the bars and grabbed his shirt, pulling him against the cold iron. "You are not going to die. I did not marry a martyr, Elias Royce. I married a fighter. They hold all the cards. Evelyn, they are the law." "They are the law in Dry Bend," she said. "But they are not the law of the United States." She pulled back, her eyes blazing. "I am going to Cheyenne." Eli stared at her. "Cheyenne is a 3 days ride, alone, through Indian Territory, through snow. I know the way," she said. "And I know a man there, Judge Archibald Sterling. He was my father's closest friend before the scandal. He is a federal judge. He has jurisdiction over the entire territory." "Evelyn, your father died in disgrace. Sterling won't help you." "Sterling loved my father," she said. "And he hates corruption. I have the map. Eli, I have the deed. And I have the signet ring you found. I am going to lay it all on his desk." "It is suicide," Eli whispered. You will freeze, or the syndicate will catch you. They are watching the jail, Evelyn said. They are watching the cabin. They are not watching the North Pass. I will take Jeb's horse. He is lending it to me. She leaned in and kissed him through the bars. It was a desperate, terrified kiss. They will bury me before they give me justice, Eli said, tears standing in his eyes. Then I will bring justice to you, she vowed. She turned and ran before he could stop her. The ride to Cheyenne was a blur of agony. Evelyn rode until her legs were numb, until her hands were frozen into claws around the reins. She slept in snowdrifts, wrapped in buffalo robes Jeb had given her. She ate dried beef while riding. She was driven by a singular image, Eli sitting in that stone box, waiting for the hangman. She reached the city on the morning of the 4th day. She was a wreck, her hair wild, her face wind-burned, her lips cracked and bleeding. She rode straight to the federal courthouse. The clerk tried to stop her. Madam, you cannot go in there. Judge Sterling is in session. Get out of my way, Evelyn rasped. She pushed past him, bursting into the chambers. Judge Archibald Sterling sat behind a massive oak desk. He was an imposing man with a mane of white hair. He looked up, annoyed, over his spectacles. What is the meaning of this intrusion? Evelyn walked to the front of the room. She reached into her coat and pulled out the heavy oilskin packet. She slammed it onto his desk. My name is Evelyn Carr, she said, her voice cracking. Daughter of Jonathan Carr, and I am here to report a theft, a murder, and a conspiracy to defraud the United States government. Sterling froze. He looked at her face, seeing the ghost of his old friend in her eyes. Jonathan's girl? He whispered. My husband is Elias Royce, she said, heir to the Royce claim. And if you do not come with me now, Sheriff Miller and the Union Pacific Railroad are going to murder him. She opened the packet. She laid out the deed, the map, and finally, the signet ring. Sterling picked up the deed. He looked at the seal. He looked at the ring. His face darkened like a thunderhead. Bailiff, Sterling roared. Get the marshal and saddle my horse. In Dry Bend, the sun was setting on the 5th day. A crowd had gathered outside the jail. They carried rope. They carried whiskey. They were worked up, angry, fed lies by Miller and his men. Inside, Eli listened to the mob. He sat on his cot, making his peace with God. He hoped Evelyn had made it to safety. That was all he prayed for. The door to the cell block opened. Sheriff Miller walked in, twirling the keys. Time to go, Eli. Miller grinned. People want to have a talk with you. You are a coward. Miller, Eli said, standing up. I am a rich man, Miller corrected. And you are history. He unlocked the cell. 2 deputies grabbed Eli, dragging him out into the street. The mob cheered. Someone threw a rock that struck Eli's shoulder. String him up, someone yelled. They dragged him toward the old oak tree at the edge of town. A noose was already thrown over a sturdy branch. Eli looked at the faces of the townspeople. He saw fear. He saw excitement. He saw the same mindless hate that had killed his parents. Any last words, Royce? Miller asked, using the name for the first time. Mocking him. Eli looked at the horizon. My wife will see you hang. Miller laughed. Your wife is probably frozen in a drift somewhere. He nodded to the deputies. They lifted Eli onto the back of a wagon positioned under the branch. They tightened the noose around his neck. Miller raised his hand to signal the horse to be whipped. Crack! A gunshot rang out. Not from the crowd, from the ridge. Miller's hat flew off his head. The crowd gasped and turned. Thundering down the main street came a phalanx of riders. 20 men on horseback. They wore dusters and carried repeating rifles. At the lead was a woman in a ragged coat, riding beside a white-haired man with the fury of God on his face. Federal marshals! The shout went up. Drop your weapons! The crowd scattered like roaches. The deputies dropped the rope. Miller stood frozen, his hand halfway to his gun. Judge Sterling pulled his horse to a sliding halt. He leveled a long-barreled pistol at Miller's chest. Sheriff Miller, Sterling bellowed. You are under arrest for conspiracy and attempted murder. If you touch that gun, I will kill you where you stand. Miller's hand trembled. He looked at the 20 rifles aimed at him. He slowly raised his hands. Evelyn leaped from her horse before it had fully stopped. She ran to the wagon. She scrambled up, her fingers tearing at the noose around Eli's neck. "Evelyn!" Eli choked out, disbelief washing over him. She loosened the rope and pulled it over his head. She threw it into the dirt. She grabbed his face, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "I told you," she sobbed, laughing and crying at the same time. "I told you I would bring justice." The marshals were cuffing Miller and his deputies. Blackwood was being dragged out of the saloon in irons. Eli looked at the chaotic scene, then at his wife. He saw the exhaustion etched into her face, the raw, bleeding cracks in her lips. He saw the woman who had ridden through hell to save him. His legs gave out. He collapsed, pulling her down with him onto the bed of the wagon. He buried his face in her shoulder, holding her as if she were the only solid thing in the universe. "You crazy woman," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You crazy, wonderful woman." "You are safe," she whispered. "It is ours, Eli. It is all ours." He pulled back to look at her. "You didn't marry a simple man, Evelyn." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No," he whispered, kissing her forehead, her eyes, her mouth. "You married a fool who found something worth dying for." Evelyn held him tight as the sun finally set. Not on a hanging, but on a new kingdom. And something worth living for, she corrected him. Something worth living for. The ink was still wet on the parchment when Eli set the pen down. It was a heavy, decisive sound in the quiet chambers of the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne. The clerk, a young man with spectacles who looked terrified of the federal marshals standing guard at the door, sprinkled sand over the signature to dry it. Elias Royce. Eli stared at the name. For 20 years. Those 2 words had been a death sentence, a secret whispered only in the dark corners of his memory. Now, staring up at him from the official deed of reinstatement, they looked like iron bars that had finally been broken. "It is done," Judge Sterling said, his voice gravelly with satisfaction. He stamped the document with the heavy seal of the territory. "The claim is recognized. The deeds held by the syndicate are null and void, proven to be obtained through fraud and coercion. The valley, the timber rights, and the grazing lands of the Royce estate are yours, son." Eli did not reach for the paper immediately. He reached for Evelyn's hand. Her fingers laced through his, warm and steady. She was wearing a new dress, purchased with the credit Judge Sterling had insisted upon, a deep blue wool that matched the intensity of her eyes. "We can go home," she whispered. Home. It was no longer just a shack in a canyon. It was 10,000 acres of history. It was a kingdom reclaimed from the ashes. The return to Dry Bend was not a retreat. It was a triumph. Word had traveled faster than their horses. The telegraph wires had sung with the news. The Royce heir was alive. The syndicate was crushed. Sheriff Miller was in chains, en route to a federal penitentiary in Leavenworth, when Eli and Evelyn rode down the main street. The town was silent, but it was not the hostile, sneering silence of before. It was a silence born of shock and a deep, permeating shame. Men who had once laughed as Eli struggled with a broken wagon wheel now took off their hats as he passed. Women who had turned their backs on Evelyn in the general store peered through their curtains, their faces pale. They rode straight to the blacksmith's shop. Jebediah Stone was sitting on a barrel outside the forge, whittling a piece of pine. He looked up as they approached, his one good eye crinkling at the corners. "Well," the old man grunted, spitting tobacco into the dust. "I heard you caused quite a stir in Cheyenne. Miller is crying about a mistrial. They say—" "Let him cry," Eli said, dismounting. He walked up to the old man and extended his hand. "Thank you, Jeb, for everything." Jebediah looked at the hand of the richest man in the territory, and then gripped it with his calloused palm. "Just glad I lived long enough to see the look on their faces. It was worth every ache in these old bones." The transition was not immediate, nor was it entirely smooth. The power vacuum left by the syndicate's collapse created chaos. There were still men who had profited from the corruption, and they viewed Eli not as a hero, but as a threat to their wallets. Arthur Blackwood, out on bail and awaiting trial, sent a messenger to the cabin, which Eli and Evelyn were temporarily repairing while they planned the house in the valley. The messenger, a nervous boy from the livery, carried a letter offering $50,000 for the timber rights alone. Eli read the letter by the fire. He didn't even look at Evelyn. He simply tossed the paper into the stove and watched it curl into black ash. "Tell Mr. Blackwood," Eli said to the boy, "that if he sets foot on Royce land again, I will not call the marshal. I will handle it as my father would have." The threats were quieter, but they were there. A fence cut in the night, a dead coyote left on their porch. But Eli was no longer the passive target. He hired 3 men, honest hands from the southern range who had no ties to Dry Bend, to patrol the perimeter. However, for every act of malice, there were a dozen acts of contrition. It started with Mrs. Gable at the general store. When Evelyn went in to buy nails for the roof, the woman refused to take her money. "Your father's account," Mrs. Gable mumbled, her face turning beet red. "We found an error in the ledger. From years back, it seems you have a credit. Mrs. Ward, Mrs. Royce." Evelyn knew it was a lie. Her father had never banked there. It was a peace offering, a clumsy, desperate attempt to wash the stain of complicity from their hands. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," Evelyn said with grace. "That is very kind." Then came the labor. When Eli began the work of rebuilding the main barn, a dozen men showed up at dawn. They carried hammers and saws. Among them was the husband of the woman who had mocked Evelyn's silk sheets. "We came to help," the man said gruffly, not meeting Eli's eyes. "Harvest is done. We have time." Eli stood on the porch, looking at the men who had watched his home burn and done nothing. He could have turned them away. He could have spat in their faces, but he looked at Evelyn. She nodded slightly. "The coffee is on the stove," Eli said. "We start with the framing." They worked in silence at first, a heavy, guilty air hanging over the yard. But as the sun rose and the sweat began to flow, the rhythm of work took over. By noon, the tension had broken. By sunset, the frame of the barn stood against the sky, strong and true. The winter passed, giving way to a ferocious, muddy spring. The snowmelt roared down from the peaks, filling the creek until it sang. The valley, the hidden valley, began to wake up. But as the earth came alive, Jebediah stone began to fade. The old blacksmith had taken a chill in late March that settled deep in his chest. He refused a doctor, saying sawbones were only good for cutting off legs. But he allowed Evelyn to bring him soup and sit by his bedside in the small room behind the forge. One rainy afternoon in April, a boy came running to the Royce cabin. "It's Jeb," the boy panted. "He is asking for you. Eli." Eli rode the stallion hard, mud flying from the hooves. When he entered the dark, smoky room, he could hear the rattle in the old man's chest from the doorway. Jebediah was lying on a cot covered in furs. His face was gray, the skin pulled tight over his skull, but his eye was open, fixed on the ceiling. Eli knelt beside the bed. "I am here, Jeb." The old man turned his head. A faint smile touched his lips. "About time. I was about to start shoeing the horses in hell." "Save a spot for me," Eli whispered, his throat tight. "Nah," Jebediah wheezed. "You got work to do here. You got a dynasty to build." He moved his hand feebly, fumbling with something under his pillow. He pulled out a small object wrapped in an oily rag. He pressed it into Eli's hand. "Your daddy gave me this," Jebediah whispered. "The day before the fire, he said the clasp was broken. Wanted me to fix it. I never got the chance to give it back." Eli unwrapped the rag. Inside lay a silver locket, tarnished black with age. He pried it open with his thumbnail. Inside was a miniature portrait, hand-painted on ivory. It was a woman with dark hair and laughing eyes. "Mother," Eli choked out. "She was a fine woman," Jebediah said, his voice fading to a whisper. "She loved you, boy, more than anything. She used to say you had the soul of a poet in the hands of a fighter. Tears dripped from Eli's face onto the quilt. He clutched the locket so hard the metal bit into his palm. "Thank you," he wept. "Don't let the bastards win. Elias," Jebediah rasped. "You keep the land. You keep the girl. You keep—" The breath rattled out of him. A long, sighing exhalation. The stillness that followed was absolute. Eli sat there for a long time, holding the image of his mother, while the rain hammered on the tin roof. He was the last of the old guard now. The witness was gone. The torch had been passed. They buried Jebediah on the hill overlooking the town. Under a marker, Eli carved himself from granite. Life moved forward. It had to. With the deed secured and the initial rebuilding done, Evelyn began to turn her eyes toward the future. She was not content to simply be the mistress of a great estate. The poverty she had seen in the town, the ignorance that had fueled the hatred against them, it gnawed at her. She set up a table in the main room of the cabin, covering it with sketches and lists. "What is all this?" Eli asked one evening, coming in from checking the herd. He smelled of rain and horse, a scent Evelyn had come to love more than any perfume. "Plans," she said, smoothing out a large sheet of paper. "For the valley." Eli leaned over her shoulder. "That looks like a schoolhouse." "It is," she said. "And this is a cooperative store. And this is a plan for sharecropping agreements." Eli frowned. "Sharecropping?" "The small ranchers," Evelyn explained, her voice animated. "The ones who were squeezed by the syndicate. They have no grazing land. They have no way to get their beef to the railhead without Blackwood's brokers taking half the profit. If we open the valley's lower pasture to them, if we pool our resources to negotiate with the railroad, we can break the stranglehold." "We would be giving away grass," Eli said slowly. "Grass that could feed our own stock. We have more grass than we can ever use," Evelyn countered. "Eli, do you want to be a baron? Do you want to be like the men who killed your father, hoarding everything until the envy of your neighbors turns to violence?" She turned in her chair to face him. "Or do you want to build something that lasts? A community, a place where no one has to fear the night?" Eli looked at the plans. He looked at the intricate calculations of grain yields and lumber costs. He looked at his wife. He saw the banker's daughter who had arrived with 2 trunks and a shattered life. He saw the woman who had hauled water until her hands bled. He saw the warrior who had ridden through a blizzard to save his life. "You are not just building a ranch," he said softly. "You are building a world. It is the only way to keep the peace," she said. "We make them partners. We make our success their success." Eli reached out and touched her cheek. "I thought I was saving you when I brought you to this canyon. I thought I was giving a stray a home." He shook his head, a wonder-filled smile spreading across his face. "But you are the visionary. Evelyn, I just see the fences. You see what is beyond them. Do you agree?" she asked. "I would give you the moon if I could reach it," he said. "Build it. Build it all." Summer arrived with a vengeance. The high country exploded into color: purple sage, yellow sunflowers, green aspen leaves trembling in the wind. One evening in July, a thunderstorm rolled over the peaks. It was not a cold winter storm, but a humid, violent summer tempest. The sky turned a bruising green, and the thunder shook the very bedrock of the canyon. Eli and Evelyn had been riding in the lower valley, inspecting the site for the new schoolhouse. When the heavens opened, "Run!" Eli shouted, laughing as the deluge hit them. They spurred their horses, racing the lightning back to the cabin. They arrived soaked to the skin, breathless, adrenaline pumping through their veins. They tumbled through the door, dripping water onto the floorboards. The fire in the stove was low, casting a warm, orange glow across the room. Eli looked at her. Her hair was plastered to her face, her dress clinging to her curves, her chest heaving with exertion. She looked wild. She looked magnificent. "You are wet," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "So are you," she replied, breathless. He reached out and pulled her to him. The kiss was not gentle. I was hungry. It was the release of months of tension, of grief, of fear. It was a celebration of survival. They stripped off their wet clothes, leaving them in a pile by the door. The air was cool, but their skin was hot. They sank onto the rug before the fire, the thunder crashing overhead, a drumbeat for their desire. "Evelyn," he groaned, his hands exploring her body as if he were mapping new territory. "Eli," she whispered, "my love, my life." They made love with a ferocity that bordered on worship. There were no shadows in the room anymore, no ghosts. There was only the firelight, the sound of the rain, and the undeniable, triumphant reality of their bodies moving together. They laughed as they moved, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. They clung to each other, slick with rain and sweat, anchoring themselves against the storm outside. Later, as the storm passed and the rain slowed to a gentle patter, they lay entangled on the rug, wrapped in a blanket. Eli rested his hand on her stomach. It was a casual gesture, possessive and protective. Evelyn covered his hand with hers. She hadn't told him yet. She had been waiting to be sure, but the sickness in the mornings, the tenderness in her breasts, the cessation of her monthly bleeding, she knew. She felt the warmth of his palm seeping into her skin, down to the tiny spark of life growing there. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. She felt his fingers still. She felt his breath hitch. He lifted his head to look at her. His hazel eyes searched hers, asking the question he dared not voice. She smiled, a slow, secret smile that contained the future. He buried his face in her stomach, kissing the skin there with a reverence that made her heart ache. He held her tighter that night than he ever had before. August brought the heat, and it brought the letter. It was delivered by a courier from the law firm in Denver that Judge Sterling had appointed to handle the final probate of the Royce estate. Eli opened it on the porch. Evelyn sat on the swing he had built her, shelling peas into a bowl. He read the letter twice. Then he lowered it, staring out at the canyon walls. "What is it?" Evelyn asked, pausing in her work. "The final survey," Eli said, his voice hollow. "The land grant included sections we didn't know about. Up north, timber stands that haven't been touched in 50 years. He walked over to her and handed her the paper. "It is not 5,000 acres. Evelyn, it is nearly 10,000. And with the back payments for the grazing rights the government seized, the cash value is over $200,000. Evelyn stared at the number. It was an incomprehensible fortune. It was enough to buy the entire town of Dry Bend 10 times over. "It is too much," she whispered. "It is blood money," Eli said. He looked at his hands. "I don't want it. I never wanted it." He knelt before her, placing his hands on her knees. "It is yours. Evelyn." She looked at him, startled. "What?" "I want to put the deed in your name," he said earnestly. "All of it. The money. The land. You are the one who saved it. You are the one who has the vision for the school and the cooperative. You are the heart of this place. I am just the man who keeps the wolves away." "Eli, no." "Yes," he insisted. "You have the education. You have the grace. I am a rough man. Evelyn, I always will be. Let me give this to you. Let me make you the queen you deserve to be." Evelyn set the bowl of peas aside. She took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "Do you think I want a kingdom without a king?" she asked softly. "You deserve better than me." "There is no better than you," she said fiercely. "You walked through fire for me. You stood against a mob for me." She picked up the letter and folded it. She placed it in his shirt pocket, right over his heart. "I refuse," she said. "Evelyn, it is not yours," she said. "And it is not mine. It is ours. Built in fire. Eli, held by love. We share the burden, just as we share the bed, just as we share this life." She took his hand and placed it back on her belly, which was just beginning to show the slightest curve. "And we will share it with him," she whispered. Or her. Eli let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for 20 years. The tension left his shoulders. He leaned his forehead against hers. "Ours," he agreed. Autumn came early to the high country. The aspen trees turned to liquid gold, shimmering against the deep green of the pines. The air turned crisp and smelled of wood smoke. On a clear afternoon, Eli and Evelyn rode up to the ridge that overlooked the hidden valley. Below them, the world was changing. The ruins of the old Royce homestead had been cleared away. In their place, the frame of a new house was rising, not a fortress, but a home with large windows to let in the light. Further down the valley, smoke curled from the chimneys of 3 new cabins, homes for the families who would work the cooperative. The foundation of the schoolhouse was laid. Cattle, fat and sleek, grazed in the tall grass. It was a scene of peace, a scene of abundance. They dismounted and stood at the edge of the cliff, the wind whipping Evelyn's skirts around her legs. She wrapped her shawl tighter, her hand resting instinctively on the swell of her stomach. She was 4 months along now, and the life inside her was strong. Eli stood behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder. "Look at it," he whispered. "It is beautiful," she said. "They said we wouldn't last the winter." Eli mused. "They said the snow would bury us. They said the wolves would pick our bones." "They didn't know us," Evelyn said. "No," Eli said. "They didn't." He turned her in his arms so he could look at her face. The wind blew a strand of dark hair across her cheek, and he brushed it away with a tenderness that still took her breath away. He looked at the lines of her face, the strength in her jaw, the fire in her eyes. He saw the woman who had slapped a bully in the general store. He saw the woman who had ridden into the teeth of a blizzard. He saw the woman who had loved him when he was nothing but a name and a pair of calloused hands. "I love you, Evelyn Royce," he said. The name sounded right now. It sounded like a promise kept. "I love you, Elias," she answered. He kissed her then. It was not the kiss of a shy ranch hand. It was not the desperate kiss of a hunted fugitive. It was the kiss of a man who had faced the darkness and won. It was fierce, devoted, and utterly unafraid. He kissed her under the vast, open sky of the west, no longer hiding from the world. The wind howled around them, carrying their story down the canyon, through the town of Dry Bend, and out across the plains. It was a story that would be told around campfires and in schoolrooms for generations to come. The story of the banker's daughter and the lost heir. The story of the simple man and the woman who saw a king. Their simple love, born in dirt and mockery, had become a legend of the West. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed the journey of Evelyn and Eli as much as I enjoyed writing it for you. It is a tale that reminds us that true wealth isn't found in gold or land, but in the courage to stand by the ones we love. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below telling me where you are listening from. It is always amazing to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this Wild West romance, please consider subscribing to From Wild West so you never miss an adventure. And please, share your thoughts in English in the comments section. Did you like the ending? What was your favorite part? Until the next time, keep the spirit of the West alive.